Yuna had been awake for 31 hours when the signal hit. She wasn't doing anything heroic. She was eating cold ramyun out of a foil pouch, squinting at a spectral calibration screen that had been drifting by 0.003 nanometers for 2 days, and arguing quietly with herself about whether it mattered. It probably didn't matter. She was going to fix it anyway, because that was the kind of person she was. The kind who couldn't sleep knowing something was slightly wrong, even if slightly wrong changed nothing in the observable universe. The Chum37 was a survey vessel, not a warship. It had the aerodynamics of a refrigerator and smelled permanently of the soybean paste someone had spilled in the galley 4 months ago during a gravity fluctuation. Yuna was its sole crew. Long-range spectral mapping didn't require more than one person, which was fine. She preferred it that way, mostly. The signal came through on a frequency that shouldn't have had anything on it. She almost missed it. The alert chimed softly. The Chum37 had a soft alert system because its previous owner had apparently been jumpy, and Yuna glanced over with a piece of noodle still hanging from her lip. She slurped it up, checked the readout, checked it again. It wasn't a natural emission. That much was obvious in the first 3 seconds. The spectral fingerprint was too ordered, too deliberate. But what stopped her cold, what made her set down the ramyun and lean so far forward her nose nearly touched the display, was this. The modulation pattern was in prime number intervals. Specifically, the first 23 primes, repeating with tiny variances. Variances that looked like, she ran the decode manually, twice, like they might be encoding something. Okay, she said out loud, to no one. Okay. She spent 4 hours decoding it before she found the language. It wasn't any human language she'd studied, and she'd studied 7. It wasn't Keth, the dominant trade tongue of the Outer Meridian systems, or Vrul, or any of the handful of documented Xeno dialects. It was something older, something that sat in the data like sediment, and it was clearly a warning. The semantic structure was unmistakable even without full translation. Danger, boundary, do not cross, do not enter. Over and over. With coordinates appended like a forwarding address for your own destruction. The coordinates pointed into the Veth Null, an uncharted region the Keth surveying guilds called Skythorum, loosely translated as the place that doesn't want to be found. Nobody went there. Not officially. Not unofficially either, as far as Yuna knew. She filed the signal in her log, flagged it, and went to bed. She dreamed about it. In the dream it was written in Hangul, which it definitely wasn't, and her mother was reading it aloud in the kitchen back in Incheon, and somehow that was the most frightening thing, that her mother's voice could carry a warning from the edge of known space as calmly as a grocery list. Yuna woke up, reread her log, and made a decision she'd later describe to people as, clearly a mistake I was always going to make. She altered course for the Veth Null. The first thing she saw when she crossed the boundary marker, an ancient Keth probe drone tumbling slowly, its warning lights long dead, was wreckage. Not recent wreckage, old. The hull fragments drifted in a loose constellation, coated in the particular kind of frost that accumulates over decades in deep vacuum. She counted 11 distinct vessel types just from the visible debris field. 11 different species, maybe more, all of them finding this place, and apparently finding something worse waiting inside it. She flew slower. She checked her sensors more often. She ate another pouch of ramyun because her hands needed something to do. The second thing she saw was a ship that wasn't entirely wreckage. It was massive, Keth Heavy Hauler class or something derived from it, and it had clearly hit something at speed because the forward section was crumpled like a paper cup and venting slow gas crystals into the dark. But the rear section had power. Faint, cycling, but power. Emergency systems. Life support, maybe. She ran bioscan. 1 life sign, barely. Yuna sat with that information for 45 seconds. She was aware, in a very calm and clear way, that this was probably a trap, or a mistake, or both. She was also aware that there was 1 life sign, barely, and she was the only person within 4 light hours, and she didn't know how to leave someone to die in a crumpled ship in the dark. She docked. The airlock cycling sequence took 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Yuna spent it putting on her environment suit, checking the seal twice, picking up the emergency medical kit, and saying several things under her breath in Korean that she wouldn't want translated. The interior of the damaged ship smelled like ozone and something organic she couldn't name. Not unpleasant, actually, more like rain on dry stone. Emergency lighting threw everything in amber. Debris had shifted to one side from the impact, and she had to climb over what turned out to be a collapsed navigation console to follow the bioscan signal deeper into the ship. She found him in the auxiliary power room. He was Keth, or Keth adjacent. Tall, even crumpled against the wall like this, with the characteristic triple-jointed limbs and the smoke-gray skin that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. His crest, the flat ridge of bioluminescent cartilage that ran from brow to nape on most Keth subspecies, was dark. That was bad. Active Keth crests glowed faintly. Dark meant unconscious at best. His eyes were closed. There was a long gash along his right forearm, sealed badly with something that had since dried rust brown. His breathing was shallow but rhythmic. Yuna knelt beside him and opened the medical kit. She'd had basic Xeno first aid training, as required for solo survey certification, but her kit was calibrated for human biology and 3 of the 6 most common outer meridian species. Keth weren't on the list. She sat there for a moment, kit open across her knees, genuinely uncertain what to do next. "Okay," she said again, quietly. "Don't panic. Think." She checked his vitals as best she could with the bioscan wand. Core temperature lower than human baseline, but apparently within normal range for Keth. She'd looked it up once after meeting a Keth trade envoy at a refueling station and finding their handshake oddly cold. Pulse analog, detectable at a point just below the jaw where his secondary circulatory vessel ran close to the surface. The cut on his arm had stopped bleeding on its own, which was either good or because he didn't have much blood left to spare. She did what she could, cleaned the wound with the universal antiseptic. Nearly everything was vulnerable to contamination regardless of biochemistry, applied a pressure seal, and propped him into a position that seemed better for whatever his respiratory anatomy was doing. Then she sat back on her heels and waited. He woke up 40 minutes later while she was checking the ship's power cell status on her handheld, and his first act was to grab her wrist so fast she yelped. His eyes were open. They were silver. Not the color silver, but actually reflective, like polished metal. And they were tracking her face with an intensity that was probably fear, but felt like being studied under a microscope. "Hey," she said, holding very still, heart doing something embarrassing in her chest. "Hey, I'm not a threat. I found your ship. You were hurt." He said something. It wasn't any language she knew. It was deep and resonant and had a clicking undertone that she felt in her back teeth more than heard. "I don't understand," she said. "Do you speak Keth Standard?" A pause. His grip on her wrist loosened slightly, which she took as a good sign. "Standard," he said. His voice in Keth Standard was still deep, still resonant, but without the clicking. It had an accent she'd never heard, something that turned vowels into questions. "You are human." "Yes," she said. "Yuna So. Survey vessel Chum 37. I picked up your distress signal." She hesitated. "It wasn't exactly a distress signal. I'm not sure what it was." Something moved in his silver eyes. "You followed the boundary warning." "I decoded it first." Another pause. His crest, she noticed, had started to glow again, very faint blue-white, like bioluminescence at the edge of vision. She'd read somewhere that was a Keth expression of complex emotion, uncontrolled, the way humans sometimes flushed without meaning to. "No one has decoded that signal in 400 years, he said. It was a good puzzle. She became aware that he was still holding her wrist, very loosely now, more like he'd forgotten than like he meant to. She didn't move. "I'm Yuna," she said again, because saying it a second time seemed right. "Sovrak," he said. "Sovrak Kamir." His thumb moved, once, across the inside of her wrist, maybe unconscious, she couldn't tell. "You should not have come here." "You'd be dead if I hadn't." "Yes," he agreed. He said it without argument, which she hadn't expected. That is also true. Getting him onto the Chamsudi 7 was an adventure. He was too tall for the standard airlock standing upright, and he'd managed to bruise at least 2 of his major joints in the crash, so he moved carefully, and with a controlled stillness that she recognized as someone managing pain without showing it. She'd done the same after a lab accident in graduate school, walked the entire length of the university medical wing with a fractured wrist, just breathing slowly, not wanting to be seen to be hurt. She recognized the performance. "You can tell me if something hurts," she said, as he lowered himself into the Chumsudi 7's cramped cargo-turned-living space with a stiffness that was not casual. "I am aware of my injuries," he said. "That's not what I said." He looked at her. The crest flickered briefly, a quick pulse of color she couldn't interpret. "My hip assembly took the impact. The joint is intact, but the surrounding tissue is compressed. It is unpleasant." "Okay," she said. "That's better. Thank you for telling me." He seemed genuinely uncertain what to do with being thanked for that. She gave him the bunk. He barely fit, even with the fold-out extension, and moved to the pilot's chair for sleeping, which she'd done before in emergencies. She checked the ship's heading, still pointed further into the Veth Null, which she hadn't corrected because she'd been a little busy. "I'll plot us a return heading," she said. "Wait." He hadn't moved from the bunk, but his voice came clearly through the open partition. "The signal you decoded. There is a reason it has not been decoded in 4 centuries. A pause. She heard him shift position carefully. "The Veth Null has a center. I was trying to reach it." "Why?" The silence lasted long enough that she turned around. He was watching her from the bunk with those silver eyes, and his crest was glowing a color she didn't have a name for, somewhere between amber and green, warm and uncertain at the same time. "Because the signal is not just a warning," he said. "The signal is also directions." She didn't sleep much that night. She sat in the pilot's chair with her knees up and her tablet in her lap, going back over the decoded signal with fresh eyes. He was right. The warning structure was there, unmistakable, but underneath it, interwoven with it like a second melody under the first, there were coordinates. Not just to the boundary, to something beyond. She'd seen the warning and stopped. She hadn't thought to look for what the warning was protecting. By 0400 ship time, she had mapped the secondary coordinate structure. It pointed to a region 4 hours deeper into the Veth Null, to an object with a gravitational signature that shouldn't exist. Too dense, too stable, too organized. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, the Veth Null drifted past the viewports. Not empty. Nothing in space was truly empty, but dim and cloud-like, the scattered matter of an ancient galaxy arm that had burned itself out long before anything in the outer meridian had evolved to notice. It was beautiful in the way that abandoned places were beautiful. Quiet. Old. She heard him wake. A small sound, a careful movement, and a few moments later he appeared in the doorway to the cockpit. He had to angle his head slightly to fit the frame. He looked at the viewports, then at her tablet. "You found the secondary structure," he said. "How long have you been looking for this?" she asked. He settled carefully into the co-pilot's seat. That was really a backup engineering console that she'd converted and was not designed for anyone of his proportions. 12 years, he said. "It is a Keth thing, not official, a private pursuit." He looked at the map on her tablet. "The signal comes from a foundry." "A what?" "A place the builders left behind." He said builders with the particular weight of a word that had been translated through 3 languages and had not fully survived the journey. The species that made the Veth Null what it is, made the signal, made many things that we still find and cannot understand. Una absorbed this. And the warning? The warning says, "Only come if you have understood us." He paused. "The directions are the test. If you can decode the directions from the warning, you have understood enough. And if you can't decode it, you turn back. If you turn back," he said quietly, "you live." She looked at the coordinate map, then at him. He was watching her, with an expression she was starting to read. Not well, but starting to. There was something in the set of his jaw, the faint pulse in his crest, that was not quite hope, but was the thing that lived next to hope, the worn and careful cousin of it. "You said you've been looking for 12 years, she said. "Yes." "And you came here alone?" "Yes." "That's—" She stopped, chose her words. "That must have been very lonely." The crest flickered. He looked away, at the viewport, at the dim, beautiful dark. "I did not think of it that way," he said, and the slight pause before he said it told her that was not entirely true. They went deeper. The Chumsudi 7 was not built for adventure, but it was built well. Una knew every sound it made, the particular hum of the drive at 60% versus 70%, the small groan the hull made at certain thermal transitions, the way the environmental system cycled with a faint whistle she'd reported twice and been told was within tolerances. It was her ship, and she knew it the way you know a person you've spent years with. She talked to it sometimes, not expecting answers. Sovrak noticed this on the second day. "You speak to the vessel," he said. "Not a judgment, observation." Old habit. She was running a systems check, because she always ran a systems check every 6 hours, and her hands were doing it automatically while she watched the nav display. My first posting was on a mining skiff that had actual mechanical problems. I got used to narrating what I was doing so I'd catch mistakes. A useful method. My supervisor thought it was insane. She smiled at the display. She wasn't wrong. He made a sound she didn't immediately classify. Later, she would understand it was a Keth approximation of a laugh, not the sound itself, just the intent of it, filtered through a vocal anatomy that did different things with amusement. "I talked to my research notes," he offered, "when I have been alone too long." "What do you say?" Another pause. His crest did the amber-green thing again. "I ask them if I am correct." "Do they answer?" "No," he said, and the corners of his mouth, the expressive ridge structure that served that function, shifted slightly. "But the asking helps." That was the first time it occurred to her that she didn't want this to end. Not the mission, the two of them, the small ship, the conversation about talking to things that didn't answer back. She kept that thought to herself and checked the nav display. The foundry was not what she'd expected. It wasn't a station or a ship or any structure she had architecture for. It was a place, a region of space where something had been done to the fabric of it, long ago, and the doing had not entirely faded. It looked, to her human eyes, like a hole in the dark that had light in it. Not starlight, something older, something that had been captured and held, and was still being held, 10,000 years after whoever held it had gone. Her instruments went strange. Not broken, they were reading, producing data, but the data was recursive, folding back on itself, producing patterns that looked intentional. "This is what happened to your ship?" she said. "Partially," Sovrak said. He was at the co-pilot console, his large hands moving over it with a precision that she'd come to respect in the last 2 days. "The foundry reacts to approach. My vessel's navigation system could not compensate. Yours?" "Mine is manually calibrated," she said. "I don't fully trust autonomous navigation. Too many bad experiences." He looked at her. "What?" she said. "You are an unusual human," he said. "I've been told that." It was a... He paused. It was a positive statement. She looked at the instruments, at the recursive data, at the impossible structure ahead. "Tell me what to expect when we go in." He told her. She listened, asked 3 questions, asked a 4th one that made him pause and then answer more carefully. They adjusted approach together, him reading the foundry's reaction patterns, her flying by feel and long experience, and the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through a doctoral thesis and 6 solo survey postings and cold ramyun at 0300. When they crossed the threshold, the ship hummed differently. The recursive data resolved. Not into anything explicable. It wasn't an answer, nothing that crisp, but into a kind of coherence. The foundry recognized that they were there. That was the only word for it. Recognized. Sovrak sat very still. His crest blazed white gold, brighter than she'd seen it, and his hands on the console were motionless. "You're all right?" she said. "Yes." His voice was rough. "I have looked for this for..." He stopped, started again. "Yes, I am all right." She did not point out that this was also not entirely true. She just stayed. They stayed for 6 hours, gathering what could be gathered. Data, images, the strange harmonic recordings her audio system made of the foundry's ambient frequencies. It was not a revelation with clean edges. It was a beginning of understanding, the first sentence of something very long. Sovrak cataloged with the focused intensity of someone who had waited 12 years and would not waste the moment. Una flew and watched and wrote notes in the margin of her survey log, with a kind of joy she hadn't felt since she was 22, and first understood what spectral cartography actually was. On the way back out, passing through the threshold, the instruments did something strange one more time. For approximately 4 seconds, Every display on the Chom37 went dark. When they came back up, there was a line of text in the navigation log that had not been there before. Yuna read it. Her breath stopped. It was in Korean. Not the formal literary Korean of official documents, the vernacular, the specific cadence of someone who'd grown up in a particular part of Incheon, saying things a particular way. Her particular way. It said, "You heard us correctly. Don't stop asking." She sat there for a long time, long enough that Sovrak noticed her stillness. Yuna. "The ship log," she said. "Look at the ship log." He looked. He was quiet. "Does it translate?" she said. "There is no translation needed," he said slowly. "I read it as..." Another pause, something she had learned to recognize as him finding words in a language not built for what he was trying to say. "I read it as my own dialect, the one from my home province, words my grandmother used." She turned to look at him. He looked back. "It spoke to both of us," she said, "in the same moment. In the language we would understand most immediately," he agreed. His crest was doing something she'd never seen it do, flickering rapidly between colors, settling on nothing, like someone who had too many things to feel and could not choose one. "The builders were thorough," she said. "Yes." The flickering slowed, settled on something warm. Thorough. They were 3 days out from the boundary of the Veth Null when his hip gave him trouble again. He managed it quietly, the way he managed most things, but she saw the careful way he moved in the galley and handed him a thermal compress without comment. He accepted it without comment. An hour later, she found him in the cargo space with it pressed to his hip, reading her spectral calibration manual. She didn't know how he'd gotten it. She'd left it on the navigation console, but he was reading it with the same focused attention he gave everything, and she had the complicated feeling of someone whose private thing has been found and is not actually upset about it. "That's mine," she said. "I know." He turned a page. "You annotated it extensively." "Those annotations are personal." He looked up. The faint glow of his crest in the dim cargo light did things to the angles of his face that her brain catalogued without asking her permission. "You wrote in the margin of page 47 that the author had clearly never actually calibrated anything in field conditions," he said. "I agree with this assessment." She sat down on a cargo crate across from him. "The author won an award." "The award is wrong." She laughed. It came out louder than she expected in the small space, and he looked at her with a startled expression. Then, slowly, the ridge corner shift that was his version of the same thing. "You're going to have to file a report," she said. "About the foundry." "Yes." The warmth in his crest dimmed slightly. "It will be complicated. Your organization doesn't know you were here. My organization told me to stop looking 3 years ago." He turned another page. "I disagreed." "How quietly did you disagree?" "Very quietly." A pause. "I resigned." She hadn't known that. She thought about it. 12 years of looking, and then continuing to look even after everything institutional had been removed, on his own, in a ship he presumably owned personally, all the way to the edge of a place the Keth called the place that doesn't want to be found. "I'll corroborate your report," she said. "Whatever you need. I have full sensor logs from the approach." He was quiet for a moment. "You don't need to do that," he said. "It's not your..." "Sovrak." She waited until he looked up. "It's also my sensor logs. It also happened to me." She hesitated because the next part was harder to say, and she said it anyway. "I'd like to keep being part of this, if that's all right." The crest went warm amber and stayed there. "Yes," he said. His voice had that rough quality again, the one she'd noticed at the foundry. "That would be... yes." She filed her survey report 13 days later from a station at the edge of the outer meridian. The official report documented spectral anomalies in Sector 7 Null, detailed the disabled vessel and a recovered crew member, and noted the detection of an unexplained signal in the boundary region requiring further study. All technically accurate. The unofficial report, which she sent to Sovrak's research archive and also kept on a secondary drive in a waterproof casing in the bottom of her kit bag, contained the full sensor logs, the decoded signal, the foundry data, and a 4-page addendum that was mostly her annotated interpretation of the recursive instrument readings and was, in her own margin notes, sometimes addressed directly to him. He sent her a 7-page response. The response was thorough and methodical and corrected two of her interpretations with compelling supporting evidence, and in the margin of the last page, in small, careful characters, he had written something in his home dialect that she did not immediately recognize and had to translate twice. The second translation confirmed the first. It said, approximately, "I talked to my research notes last night. For the first time, they answered." She read it 3 times, sitting in the pilot's chair of the Chamsuri 7, with the lights low and the drive-on quiet cruise, and the stars coming through the viewport the way they always did. Patient, ancient, entirely indifferent to individual humans and their feelings. The soybean paste smell had faded, finally, after she'd scrubbed the galley again. His crest had left a faint phosphorescent smudge on the ceiling of the cargo space from where he'd been reading, and she hadn't wiped it off. She pulled up a new message and thought about what to say. Outside, the universe was enormous and old and full of things left behind by those who had understood it better. Inside, the ship hummed in its familiar voice, and Eunice, who had once called her spectral calibration manual her most personal possession, began to type. She started with his name. That was enough.